He walked into class with nothing but a notebook, yet the professor stopped the entire lecture to humiliate him. Laughter filled the room as the teacher sneered. "People like you don't belong in calculus." But when the boy picked up the chalk, what happened next silenced everyone. Was this quiet black kid about to expose the biggest lie in the room? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall buzzed with restless chatter, the kind that always filled the room just before a professor's voice cut it to silence. Hundreds of students crammed into the tiered seats, notebooks open, pens ready, laptop screens glowing faintly. It was the kind of class where students competed not just for grades but for recognition, the invisible crown of being one of Professor Ridley's favorites. At the front, Professor Jonathan Ridley adjusted his glasses and scribbled a dense equation across the board. His strokes were sharp, almost aggressive, each symbol a reminder that he, not the students, commanded the territory of calculus. His reputation preceded him: brilliant, sharp-tongued, unyielding. He was known to humiliate those he considered unworthy, turning mistakes into spectacles. Some whispered that he secretly enjoyed it, that the humiliation was part of the lesson. In the back, Jamal Carter sat quietly, head bent low, his pencil tapping against the margin of his notebook. He wasn't texting, wasn't whispering, wasn't slouching like some others. He was listening, absorbing everything. But Ridley's eyes were already scanning, looking for a target. His gaze lingered on Jamal a second too long, and the choice was made.
"Mr. Carter," Ridley's voice sliced through the air. The room hushed.
Jamal's head lifted slowly, his deep brown eyes calm but cautious. He knew what was coming.
"Why don't you come down here?" Ridley continued, gesturing to the board with his chalk. "Let's see how well you've been keeping up."
A ripple of excitement moved through the class. Some students leaned forward, eager for the show. Ridley's challenges weren't questions. They were traps, designed to expose weakness. And everyone knew Jamal was different. He was quiet, withdrawn, not part of any of the study groups or social circles. That alone made him suspicious. Jamal stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked slowly down the steps. His sneakers squeaked faintly, a sound amplified in the silence. He reached the board, eyes scanning the problem written there. It wasn't just difficult, it was deliberately convoluted, the kind of question Ridley used in graduate seminars, not freshman lectures. "Go on," Ridley said, stepping aside. "Show us what you've got." Jamal's hand tightened around the chalk. He could see the path to the solution forming in his head, but he hesitated. He knew how this would look. If he solved it too easily, it would seem suspicious. If he stumbled, they would laugh. Either way, Ridley had already written the ending. From the corner of the hall came a stifled laugh. Someone whispered, "He's done for." Another voice muttered, "Man, why'd he even call him?" Jamal took a breath, steady and deep. His silence stretched long enough to feed the tension. To Ridley, that pause was confirmation. The professor said, tilting his head, voice dripping with false sympathy. "Not quite as easy as it looks, is it? Some of you will learn that higher mathematics isn't for everyone. And that's okay. Some students should perhaps consider other paths." The implication hung heavy. Everyone understood what he meant. Students like Jamal. A few chuckles echoed. Jamal didn't move. He just stared at the board, chalk still in hand, his knuckles whitening. Inside, a storm brewed, but his face remained unreadable. He wasn't about to perform on command, not for someone who had already decided his worth. "Mr. Carter," Ridley pressed, his voice sharp now. "Any day now." Still silent. "Or," Ridley added with a thin smile, "would you prefer I assign you something easier? Something more fitting?" The words cut deeper than laughter. Easier, fitting, words soaked in condescension. Words that didn't just question Jamal's math ability, they questioned his place in the room. The class shifted in their seats, uncomfortable yet entertained. A few sympathetic eyes glanced at Jamal, but no one spoke. They had learned not to get in Ridley's way. Jamal placed the chalk down gently, his hand trembling ever so slightly, not with fear but with the weight of restraint. His eyes flickered toward Ridley, steady, burning, a silent refusal to break. Ridley smirked, mistaking silence for surrender. "As I thought," he said, his voice carrying across the lecture hall. "Perhaps stick to something easier, Mr. Carter. Calculus demands a certain kind of mind." The class chuckled again, but not all of them laughed this time. Some saw something different in Jamal's expression. something that didn't fit the narrative Ridley was trying to write. His silence wasn't ignorance. It was control. And in that silence, something shifted. Because while everyone assumed Jamal was just another student doomed to fail, no one knew the truth. Not yet. As Jamal walked back up the steps to his seat, his eyes never leaving the board, there was a storm behind them, silent but certain, waiting for the moment to break. The storm in Jamal's eyes followed him up the lecture hall steps. But as he slid into his seat, the noise of the classroom drowned it out. The laughter, the whispers, the scribbles of pens, all of it pressed on him, like a weight. But Jamal had carried heavier before. Because long before Ridley tried to break him in a lecture hall, the world had already tested Jamal Carter, in ways no exam could measure. The flashbacks came easily, uninvited but sharp, like scenes stitched into his memory. He could still see the cramped apartment on the east side of Atlanta, where the wallpaper peeled in strips and the heat often cut out in the middle of winter. His mother, Tanya Carter, worked morning shifts at a diner and overnight cleaning offices. Jamal often woke up to the faint smell of bleach on her uniform, and the sound of her weary sighs as she counted tips and small bills at the kitchen table. "Baby," she'd whisper when she thought he was asleep. "We'll get through this. Just keep your head down and do good in school." Jamal listened. He always listened. But keeping his head down wasn't as easy as Tanya hoped. At school, Jamal's quietness made him a target. He was the boy who raised his hand too much, who carried books too heavy for his backpack, who sat alone at lunch. His blackness made him visible. But his brilliance made him unbearable to those who believed kids like him were supposed to fit a different mold. He remembered one afternoon in middle school, when a teacher handed back graded tests. Jamal's paper bore a bold red 100 at the top. A boy across the aisle snorted, crumpled his own test, and muttered just loud enough, "Of course he gets it. They probably gave him the answers. That's how they all pass." The sting wasn't in the words alone. It was in the nods from classmates, the quiet agreement, the teacher's silence. No one defended him. Jamal learned then that intelligence could be twisted into suspicion when it didn't come in the package people expected. But there was one place Jamal found peace: numbers. Late at night, while Tanya slept between shifts, Jamal sat at the kitchen table with notebooks spread wide. He scribbled equations, sometimes until his fingers cramped and the pencil smudged across his hands. To him, numbers weren't just answers, they were escape routes. They didn't laugh at him, didn't question his worth. They obeyed rules, elegant and unshakable. By the time he was 13, Jamal was borrowing old college textbooks from the library. The librarians knew his face so well they stopped asking why a middle schooler wanted advanced math. He'd sit in the quietest corner, tracing lines of calculus problems that most students wouldn't see until their late teens. Tanya sometimes worried. She'd shuffle past him in the kitchen at 3 a.m., eyes half shut from exhaustion. "Baby, you need to sleep. Books will be there tomorrow." "I know, Mama," Jamal would answer softly, closing one notebook while opening another. He couldn't stop. Math didn't just call to him, it consumed him. But obsession came with its own shadows. At school, his notebooks made him stand out more. Kids mocked him, calling him professor with sneers instead of respect. Once, a group of boys cornered him in the hallway and dumped his math papers into a puddle. Watching the ink run, Jamal picked them up silently, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, his chest burned. He never told Tanya. She was already stretched thin, carrying the weight of 2 jobs and the fear of rent notices. Jamal chose silence, burying himself deeper into equations. Every insult, every slight, became fuel for another late-night session at the kitchen table. By high school, his brilliance could no longer be hidden. Jamal joined math competitions, reluctantly, urged by a teacher who saw his potential. But even victories brought suspicion. After one regional win, a parent confronted the organizers, whispering that there's no way that boy figured it out alone. The accusation lingered, poisoning the triumph. Jamal's quiet demeanor didn't help. He wasn't the type to smile for cameras or bask in applause. He let others take the spotlight, while he slipped back into the shadows with his notebooks. To the world, his silence looked like weakness. But to him it was armor. The internet became his second home. Jamal discovered free lecture videos, online problem sets, math forums where people debated abstract theorems. He lurked at first, reading more than writing, absorbing everything like a sponge. Eventually, he began posting solutions, precise, methodical, often faster than graduate students who dominated the forums. Some users accused him of copying. Others asked if he was a professor hiding behind a fake account. Jamal never revealed his age, never corrected them. He let his work speak. By the time he graduated high school, he had already worked through material most undergraduates hadn't touched. His teachers marveled at him, but even their praise carried a hint of disbelief. It was as though his intelligence needed constant justification, constant proof. One night, Tanya found him asleep at the table, cheek pressed against an open textbook. She shook her head, pulling a blanket over him. Her tired eyes lingered on the pages filled with symbols she couldn't begin to understand. "You're gonna change something, baby," she whispered to the dark room. "Even if they don't see it yet." That was the truth of Jamal Carter. While the world saw a poor black kid from a struggling neighborhood, he was quietly solving problems that left even graduate students stumped. But none of that brilliance showed in the lecture hall. Not when Ridley sneered at him. Not when classmates laughed. Jamal had learned to tuck his genius away, to let it live in notebooks and late nights, far from the eyes that judged before they understood. And so, as he stepped onto campus for the first time, bags heavy with books, shoulders squared against the stairs, Jamal carried two identities. To the world he was another freshman, another face in a crowd that didn't expect much from him. But beneath that quiet exterior lived a mind honed in shadows, sharpened by doubt, fueled by every insult that had ever told him he didn't belong. That hidden brilliance remained invisible on his first day of Ridley's class, where the professor's eyes scanned the room, already seeking a weakness to exploit. The memory of that first humiliation in Ridley's lecture hall lingered as Jamal walked across the manicured lawns of the university. The contrast between his world and this campus was jarring. Gleaming buildings, trimmed hedges, students lounging in designer clothes, it all spoke of privilege he had never touched. Every step felt like trespassing into a place designed for others, not him. He carried his books close, head down, blending into the background as best he could. But no matter how quiet he tried to be, he was noticed. Not in the way of admiration or welcome, but in the way someone notices something out of place, something that doesn't quite belong. On his first day in the cafeteria, Jamal slid his tray onto an empty table. The room buzzed with clusters of students laughing, comparing schedules, trading stories of vacations and prep schools. Jamal sat alone, quietly eating, his headphones dangling but not playing any music. A group of boys nearby glanced at him, one whispering under his breath, "Scholarship kid." Another smirked, "Bet he's in over his head already." Their words weren't loud, but loud enough. Jamal didn't respond. He just kept eating, each bite harder to swallow than the last. Dorm life brought no escape. His roommate Kyle came from a family of surgeons, his side of the room decorated with gadgets, speakers, and clothes with tags that cost more than Jamal's monthly rent back home. Kyle was polite at first, but distance grew quickly. Invitations to hang out were scarce, and when friends of Kyle visited, their eyes slid past Jamal as though he were invisible. He wasn't part of their world. He wasn't even on its margins. He was an outsider they tolerated because the housing office had placed him there. The classes themselves were no kinder. In philosophy, a professor asked a question about justice, and Jamal raised his hand, offering a thoughtful answer. Instead of acknowledgement, there was silence. The professor quickly moved on, calling on another student, who repeated Jamal's point in clumsier words, and yet received praise. Jamal wrote the moment down in his notebook later that night, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence, a quiet record of what he endured. At night he called his mother, keeping his voice light. "It's good, Mama. Different, but good." Tanya wanted to believe him, wanted to think her sacrifices had planted him in fertile soil. Jamal never told her about the stares, the whispers, the moments of erasure. Protecting her from that truth felt easier than letting her carry it with him. The divide grew sharper in Ridley's class. Ridley's reputation as a hard but fair teacher crumbled quickly in Jamal's experience. He noticed how Ridley's praise flowed easily toward the wealthy white students who stumbled through half answers, yet turned sharp when Jamal raised his hand. When Jamal solved a homework problem others struggled with, Ridley's response wasn't acknowledgement, but suspicion. "Show me how you got there. Don't just tell me the answer." One afternoon, Jamal walked into the library to study. He found a table in the back, spread his notebooks, and began scribbling equations. Minutes later, two students from class sat across from him. They weren't friends, not even acquaintances, but they leaned close, whispering just loud enough.
"You think he's really doing that?"
Looks like he's just copying from somewhere.
The other chuckled. Yeah, probably some YouTube shortcut. Guys like him don't just figure this stuff out. Their words stabbed. But Jamal kept his eyes on the page, his pencil scratching faster, as if proving them wrong in silence was the only weapon he had. Yet not everyone dismissed him. A girl from class, Emily, approached him one day after lecture. She was pale blonde, her accent polished with private schools. Hey, that thing you wrote on the board. It was really clever. Her voice carried genuine surprise, as though the compliment itself astonished her. You're actually good at this. Jamal nodded, murmured a quiet thank you, then gathered his books. Her words were meant as praise, but the pause before actually revealed more than she realized. Even kindness carried the shadow of disbelief. It became a pattern, invisibility or suspicion. Jamal learned to walk the fine line between being noticed too much and not at all. His notebooks filled with pages of calculus problems, hidden proof of his worth. But the more he excelled in silence, the more Ridley's gaze followed him, sharper each time. It was as though Ridley sensed something dangerous in Jamal's quiet competence, a disruption to the order he believed in. One evening, as Jamal returned to his dorm after a late study session, he overheard two boys in the hallway, both from Ridley's class. Man, Ridley's gonna eat that Carter kid alive. You see the way he froze at the board? He doesn't belong here, not in this class. The second boy laughed, adding that he drops out by the end of the semester. Some kids just aren't cut for this level. They walked past, not even realizing Jamal was there. He stood frozen for a moment, books heavy in his arms, before pushing into his room silently. The words replayed in his head all night. Not because he believed them, but because they confirmed something he had always felt. No matter how much work he did, no matter how many problems he solved, this place was built to remind him that he wasn't supposed to be there. But Jamal didn't crumble. He wrote in his notebook that night, line after line of equations, determination etched into every symbol. For him, math wasn't just study, it was resistance. Every problem solved was proof that he belonged, even if no one else believed it yet. While the campus divided him from others by race, class, and assumption, Jamal built his own world in the margins. But in doing so, he drew the attention of the one man who would do everything possible to make that world collapse. Professor Ridley. As Jamal sat in Ridley's next lecture, scribbling notes, he didn't notice the professor watching him from the front, chalk in hand, a thin smile forming. Ridley wasn't just teaching anymore. He was plotting. The week after Ridley's pointed stare, Jamal walked into class to find a stack of papers on each desk. The first calculus quiz had arrived sooner than expected, its timing deliberate. Ridley stood at the front, hands clasped, announcing in his clipped tone, "This will measure how well you've been keeping up. No tricks, just the basics." His smile, however, betrayed the promise. Jamal already knew the man never dealt in fairness, only in control. The classroom settled into silence, as pencils scratched and calculators clicked. Jamal bent over the paper, scanning the problems. They weren't ordinary. Each one was tangled with unnecessary complications. Questions twisted in ways meant to trip students rather than test them. But to Jamal, the noise in the problems quieted quickly. His pencil moved in steady strokes, the answers surfacing as though they'd been waiting for him. By the time others were halfway through, Jamal had filled the page with clean, precise steps. 20 minutes before the deadline, Jamal placed his pencil down. He looked around, the room still hunched over, students biting their lips, scribbling furiously. Jamal hesitated, aware that finishing early would only draw attention, but the paper was complete. He slid it forward, walked down the aisle, and laid it on Ridley's desk. Ridley's eyes flickered up. Finished? His tone held disbelief, not curiosity. Yes, sir, Jamal answered quietly, retreating to his seat. Whispers followed him back. Already? No way, someone muttered. Another voice snickered. Guess we know who's cheating. Jamal kept his gaze down, steady, though his chest tightened. He knew this wasn't about math anymore. Days later, the graded quizzes came back. Ridley distributed them with his usual air of authority, pausing briefly at Jamal's row. When Jamal's paper slid onto his desk, a bold 72 sat at the top. Jamal blinked. He flipped through the pages. Every answer was correct. Every solution flowed logically. Yet red ink stained the margins. Insufficient steps shown. Unclear reasoning. Too rushed. Jamal felt heat rise in his chest. He had shown his work, clean, deliberate, even more detailed than many around him. He glanced sideways. A student beside him had received an 88, despite half-finished equations and messy scribbles. Another had crossed out steps, errors corrected mid-solution, yet bore a proud 90. The inconsistency was glaring. After class, Jamal approached Ridley's desk. His voice was quiet but firm. "Professor, I don't understand. The answers are correct." And I showed my steps. Ridley didn't look up from the stack he was arranging. "Mathematics isn't just about getting the answer. It's about clarity of thought. Your work was unconventional, hard to follow, but the logic was there." Jamal pressed gently. "It's the same methods, just cleaner." Ridley finally looked up, eyes cold behind his glasses. "Clean isn't always correct. If you want higher marks, Mr. Carter, you'll need to show me you're not just copying answers." "Understood?" The word copying landed heavier than the grade itself. Jamal caught the subtle accusation that he couldn't have arrived at the solutions alone. His throat tightened, but he nodded, knowing further protest would only cement Ridley's judgment. As students filtered out, Jamal overheard one whisper, "Told you he wasn't as smart as he acts." Another replied, "Yeah, Ridley sees through him. That's why he's tough on him." The words burrowed deeper than the red ink. It wasn't just Ridley's grading. It was the validation it gave to everyone's doubt. That night, Jamal sat at his dorm desk, pulling the quiz from his bag. He rewrote every problem, this time adding extra lines of reasoning, as if over-explaining to an invisible critic. The solutions filled pages, far beyond what most professors demanded. He looked at the stack of work, frustration gnawing. It wasn't about showing clarity. It was about proving he deserved to sit in that room at all. But something inside him shifted. This wasn't about a grade. It was a signal. For the first time, Jamal realized Ridley's class wasn't a test of calculus. It was a test of endurance. Could he survive the doubt, the subtle sabotage, the constant demand to prove what others were freely granted? In the following days, Jamal noticed patterns. Students who stumbled through explanations still received encouragement. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities. But when Jamal spoke, every answer was dissected. His tone scrutinized, his silence interpreted as ignorance. His skin made his work heavier, his presence louder, his margin for error non-existent. One afternoon, as Jamal studied in the library, Emily approached again, her notebook in hand. "Hey, I looked at the quiz solutions," she said softly. "Yours made more sense than half the ones Ridley praised. I don't get why he marked you down." Her words were kind, but the hesitation in her voice betrayed the truth. She got it. She just didn't want to say it. Jamal offered a polite smile. "It's fine. I'll just show more steps next time." But inside he knew it wasn't about steps. It was about him. The twist came the following week. Ridley returned another set of graded homework. And this time, Jamal's paper bore a glaring comment in red. Suspiciously similar to advanced methods not covered in this class. His score, 68. Jamal's stomach dropped. The accusation was louder now, written in ink for anyone who glanced at his page. Other students noticed. A boy leaned across the aisle, smirking. "Man, he's getting busted for trying too hard." A girl whispered. "He probably found answers online. That's why Ridley doesn't trust him." The words spread like wildfire, reinforcing the narrative Ridley had been quietly building. Jamal didn't protest this time. He sat quietly, pen tapping against his notebook, his face calm while his chest ached. Ridley wasn't just marking him down, he was planting seeds of doubt, making Jamal look like an imposter to everyone around him. That night, Jamal filled another notebook with problems, writing until his hand cramped. Every solution was perfect, every line airtight. He knew the truth. But truth, he was learning, wasn't always enough. Jamal decided he would let his work speak louder than any suspicion. But as he left the library the next evening, he saw Ridley standing near the exit, watching him with the faintest smirk, as if already plotting the next trap. Ridley's smirk in the library exit was not a passing glance. It was a warning. The days that followed proved. In every lecture, his eyes seemed magnetized to Jamal, scanning for the slightest hesitation, the faintest slip. Jamal could feel the attention pressing against him like a weight, even before Ridley spoke his name. And when he did, it was never for the ordinary problems, never for the questions that measured comprehension. No, Ridley reserved the sharpest edges for Jamal. "Mr. Carter," Ridley called one morning, chalk snapping between his fingers. "Why don't you demonstrate the application of Leibniz's rule to this integral?" He scrawled a complex equation across the board, the kind of problem meant for students far beyond this course. Heads turned, whispers rustled. Everyone knew it wasn't a fair question. Jamal knew it too. He walked to the board, chalk cool against his hand. The solution unfolded in his mind clearly, but he chose each movement carefully, pacing himself. The silence stretched until it cracked. A snicker from the back row, then another. Ridley didn't silence them. He never did when it was Jamal at the board. Instead, he stood with arms folded, expression neutral but eyes gleaming with expectation. Jamal's hand shook slightly as he wrote, not because he didn't know the answer, but because every line felt like an act of defiance under 1,000 unseen judgments. When he finished, the board held a neat, step-by-step solution. For a brief moment, silence lingered. Then Ridley leaned forward. "Adequate," he said coldly. "Though your hesitation suggests this isn't second nature. Work on that." The class erupted in muffled laughter. Adequate. A word chosen to diminish, not to acknowledge. Jamal wiped his hands against his jeans and returned to his seat, his face unreadable. Inside, though, the insult carved deep. It became routine. Every lecture, Jamal's name echoed like a bell before battle. Sometimes he answered perfectly. Sometimes he hesitated, calculating how much effort to reveal, how much to hold back. No matter the outcome, the response was the same. A raised eyebrow, a dismissive comment, a subtle seed of doubt planted for the class to water with their whispers. "Why's he always on him?" one boy muttered after class. Another replied, "Because he's hiding something. Nobody's that good and that quiet." Suspicion grew in the spaces between lectures, whispered in dorm hallways, passed along in study groups Jamal was never invited to. And yet Ridley's attempts to erode him backfired in one crucial way. Jamal's grades remained nearly flawless. Quiz after quiz, assignment after assignment. He turned in work too precise to be ignored. Ridley's red ink slashed through his pages, but the numbers always correct kept Jamal afloat. To some students it was baffling. To others it was infuriating. His survival itself became a threat. Emily noticed. One afternoon in the library, she found him again, his notebook spread like maps. "You know he's targeting you, right?" she whispered, glancing around as though Ridley himself might hear. Jamal shrugged, eyes still on his equations. "Doesn't matter. Math doesn't lie." She frowned. "Maybe not. But people do." Her words lingered even after she walked away. Jamal stared at his page, pencil hovering, realizing the truth he'd avoided. This wasn't just about solving problems. It was about surviving perception. The ridicule deepened. By the third week, laughter followed Jamal before he even stood up. Students elbowed each other when Ridley called his name, whispering bets on whether he'd falter. Jamal learned to walk slower, to breathe deeper, to let their jeers roll off him. But each moment chipped at his dignity, a small fracture in a wall he struggled to keep standing. Still, equations danced in his mind with perfect clarity. Numbers never mocked him, never doubted. Alone in his dorm, surrounded by silent pages of solutions, Jamal felt whole again. But classrooms weren't silent, and Ridley was determined to make sure they never were. One morning, something unexpected happened. Ridley posed an impossibly complex problem, eyes locked on Jamal. As Jamal worked through it on the board, a boy in the back, one of the louder skeptics, whispered too loudly, "Bet he screws it up." But when Jamal finished, even Ridley couldn't find fault. The solution was elegant, exact. For once, silence filled the room, not mocking, but stunned. The boy who had mocked him muttered, "Damn." Emily, seated near the front, caught Jamal's eye for the first time with something resembling respect. It was a shift, small but real. Jamal felt it too. For a moment, the routine cracked. Ridley's face, however, remained stone. "Correct," he said finally. "Though again, Mr. Carter, your methods are unconventional. Be careful not to get lost in shortcuts." The dismissal was expected, but his tight jaw betrayed something else. Unease. That unease spread quietly. A few students began to wonder, was Jamal truly brilliant, or was something else at play? The whispers changed shape. Where once they mocked his failures, now they doubted his successes. Suspicion became the new ridicule. Jamal felt it everywhere. In the cafeteria, when eyes lingered too long. In the dorms, when voices dropped to hushed tones. As he passed, his victories didn't shield him. They sharpened the knives. pointed his way. And then came the announcement, the midterm exam. Ridley stood at the front of the hall, chalk tapping against the board. This, he declared, will separate those who truly understand from those who merely get by. His eyes flicked toward Jamal, deliberate, almost daring. The words weren't an announcement, they were a threat. For Jamal, the midterm loomed not as a test of calculus, but as the stage Ridley had been building since day one. Every humiliation, every pointed question, every whisper in the back rows. They all led here. Jamal closed his notebook that night, his heart steady but heavy. He would let his work speak louder than the laughter, louder than Ridley's doubt. But what Jamal didn't know was that Ridley wasn't preparing a fair exam. He was planning a trap, one designed to expose him in front of everyone. The day of the midterm arrived with a silence heavier than any ordinary exam day. Students filed into the lecture hall with faces tight, shoulders hunched under the weight of formulas they had crammed overnight. Jamal carried only a single notebook and a pen, his expression calm but inwardly braced for battle. He had felt this exam looming for weeks, not as a test of knowledge, but as the stage Ridley had crafted for his downfall. Ridley moved down the aisles with an unusual sharpness, placing exam packets face down on each desk. "You will have 90 minutes, he said, voice carrying that clipped tone meant to intimidate. "No calculators. Show all work. Any suspicion of academic dishonesty will be taken seriously." His eyes lingered on Jamal as he spoke those last words. The implication was clear to everyone. When Ridley called time to begin, the sound of flipping papers filled the hall. Students groaned quietly as they scanned the problems, each question long, tangled, designed to consume time. Jamal's eyes moved across the page with quick precision. He had seen through Ridley's tricks before, and here too, he recognized patterns buried under the clutter. Beneath the noise, the solutions glowed in his mind, as if the equations had been waiting for him all along. While others bent over their desks, erasing furiously and chewing their pencils raw, Jamal's hand glided smoothly, his page filled with precise steps, neat lines of reasoning. No hesitation. He paced himself, methodical, checking each answer twice before moving on. Within an hour, his packet was complete. He looked around. Most of the class was still drowning in the second problem. Jamal hesitated. Turning it in early would mark him again. Fuel whispers. But to sit idle felt dishonest to himself. Slowly, he rose, the sound of his chair scraping echoing in the tense silence. Heads turned. Ridley's eyes snapped to him. "Finished?" Ridley asked flatly, voice cutting through the quiet. "Yes, sir." Jamal walked down, set the packet on the desk, and returned to his seat. Whispers broke out immediately. "Already? No way. He's faking it." Jamal kept his gaze steady, ignoring them, though his chest felt heavy with the weight of their judgment. When the exams were returned days later, the air in the hall was thick with anticipation. Students flipped through their papers, groaning or sighing in relief. Jamal received his last. He turned it over, heart steady. At the top, 100. Perfect. Every answer marked correct. For the first time all semester. No red slashes across the margins. But before he could breathe, Ridley's voice rang out. "Class, I'd like to address something." His eyes cut to Jamal. "There are, on occasion, results that appear unusual. Results that suggest methods beyond what has been covered in this course. While some of you struggled, one paper was flawless, suspiciously flawless." The hall went silent. All eyes turned to Jamal. Ridley didn't name him. He didn't need to. The implication was a spotlight. A boy in the back muttered, "Knew it." Another whispered, "Cheating." Heads nodded. Their suspicion had been waiting for fuel, and Ridley had just poured gasoline. Jamal's hands clenched under the desk. He spoke, his voice firm but low. "I didn't cheat." Ridley's lips curved into a thin smile. "Then you won't mind a private examination. Oral. In my office. Next week. If your understanding is truly your own, it should be no problem." Gasps rippled through the room. An oral exam was rare, usually reserved for students suspected of dishonesty. Jamal felt the eyes of his classmates dig into him, some smirking, others simply watching with cold curiosity. Emily's head turned sharply toward Ridley, her expression uneasy, but she said nothing. No one did. Silence was safer than standing beside Jamal. Ridley continued, "Until then, Mr. Carter, your exam will remain under review." He stacked the papers with deliberate care, dismissing the class. As students shuffled out, whispers trailed behind. "Told you he was too good to be real." Watch. He won't pass that oral. Bet this is the end of him. Jamal packed his bag slowly, each word embedding itself like shards. When he finally left the hall, his steps felt heavier than ever. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the campus paths, students laughing and chatting as though the world wasn't collapsing around him. He pulled his jacket tighter, heading toward the library. That night, Jamal sat at his desk until dawn, notebook pages piling high. He retraced every theorem, every formula, working problems far beyond the course material. His mind spun through proofs, integrals, differential equations, each line written as if his life depended on it, because in a way, it did. For Jamal, this wasn't just about proving he could do calculus. It was about proving he belonged in that classroom, in that university, in a world that had doubted him from the start. He knew Ridley wouldn't play fair. He knew the oral exam was a trap, but he also knew something deeper. The only way to survive was to be undeniable. It wasn't enough for Jamal to be right. He had to prove he wasn't a fraud. As the week crept closer, Jamal's eyes grew darker with sleepless nights, his notebooks filling faster than ever. And on the evening before the oral exam, a slip of paper appeared under his dorm door, unsigned, with only 6 words, "Ridley will never let you win." The slip of paper had haunted Jamal through the week. "Ridley will never let you win." The handwriting was jagged, hurried, but unmistakably human. He had no idea who left it. A warning? A threat? A truth spoken in secret? He never showed it to anyone, folding it tightly and tucking it in his notebook, where it burned in his thoughts with every equation he solved. By the morning of the oral exam, his body was weary from sleepless nights, but his mind was sharper than ever, honed by repetition and quiet fury. Ridley's office sat at the far end of the mathematics building, its oak door polished, its brass handle gleaming. Jamal arrived 5 minutes early, books pressed against his chest, jaw tight. Inside, the office was lined with shelves of thick volumes, framed certificates, and a single window spilling pale light across the desk. Ridley stood behind it, adjusting his tie, his smile thin. "Mr. Carter," he said smoothly, punctual. "Let's begin." On the desk lay a blank pad of paper and a stack of problems. Not homework problems. Not textbook exercises. These were advanced graduate level in difficulty, some written by Ridley himself. He slid the first sheet across. "Solve this. Out loud, step by step. No silence." Jamal picked up the pencil, eyes scanning the equation. Partial derivatives, complex variables, traps meant to overwhelm, but the path unfolded in his mind almost instantly. His pencil moved quickly, his voice calm, as he narrated each step. Differentiate with respect to x, substitute here, simplify. Within minutes, the solution stood complete. Ridley leaned forward, lips pressed tight. He marked it correct with a faint scrawl. Next, another sheet slid forward. Jamal worked again, his words steady, his steps exact. Ridley's pen could barely keep up. By the 4th problem, something shifted. Ridley's controlled posture faltered. His pen tapped against the desk, his jaw tightening each time Jamal's solution landed flawless and swift. He tried interrupting. "Why did you take that step? Isn't there another way?" Jamal met his eyes briefly, calm, and explained with clarity Ridley couldn't twist. Hours seemed to compress into minutes. Problem after problem fell before Jamal, his voice unwavering, his hand gliding. At one point, Ridley dropped his pen, fumbling as Jamal continued without pause. The professor bent to retrieve it, his face briefly hidden, but Jamal caught the flicker of something unsettled, almost fearful. For the first time, the power dynamic tilted. Jamal wasn't performing for approval. He was revealing truth, undeniable and unbent. Ridley wasn't grading a student anymore. He was chasing a mind that outran him. Ridley leaned back, finally, folding his arms, his eyes sharp. "Interesting," he muttered. "Very interesting." His voice was controlled, but the mask had cracks. For the first time, he saw not a stereotype to dismiss, but a genius that threatened his authority. Jamal didn't gloat. He simply set the pencil down, hands folded quietly. His silence wasn't submission. It was composure. Ridley had tried to break him with suspicion, with traps, but here Jamal sat, intact, undeniable. And yet, the victory wasn't clean. Ridley stood, pacing to the shelves, his back turned. "You're clever," he said slowly. "But cleverness can be misleading. You've rehearsed, haven't you? anticipated these kinds of problems. There's a difference between memorization and understanding. Jamal's chest tightened. Even now, the professor reached for dismissal, refusing to acknowledge what was plain. I didn't memorize, Jamal said softly. I've been studying these methods for years. They make sense to me. Ridley turned sharply, eyes narrowing. For years? Don't exaggerate. These are graduate-level concepts. No freshman walks in already fluent. I did, Jamal replied, his tone even. Because I had to. The words hung heavy. It wasn't arrogance. It was truth. And that truth unsettled Ridley more than any answer on the page. Silence filled the office. Outside, footsteps echoed faintly in the hall, distant, indifferent. Inside, the air pulsed with quiet defiance. Ridley finally sat again, tapping his fingers against the desk. You've proven something, Mr. Carter, but proof is delicate. You see, reputation matters in academia, and without credibility, genius collapses. He leaned closer, voice lowering, and credibility is something you haven't earned yet. The words were not a concession. They were a warning. Jamal realized then that Ridley would never admit defeat. The professor wasn't interested in truth. He was interested in control. Jamal gathered his things, standing slowly. His expression revealed nothing, but his heart pounded. He had walked in accused of fraud and walked out undeniable, but not safe. For the first time, the professor saw not a stereotype, but a genius that threatened his authority. As Jamal left the office, Ridley watched him go, his smile returning tighter, darker. If he couldn't dismantle Jamal with equations, he would find another way, and Jamal, still clutching his notebook, knew the battle wasn't over. It was only shifting. Jamal's footsteps echoed down the hallway after leaving Ridley's office, each step heavy with the strange mix of relief and dread. He had done what they said he could. He had faced questions designed to break him, solved problems faster than Ridley could process, and left no doubt that his brilliance was real. But the slip of paper tucked in his notebook whispered a deeper truth. Proof was never enough. In a world built on perception, his victories would always be questioned. By the next morning, whispers had already spread across campus. The oral exam wasn't supposed to be public knowledge, but rumors leaked faster than ink. Some students whispered that Jamal had embarrassed Ridley in his own office. Others claimed Ridley had caught him red-handed, that the oral exam was proof of cheating. The contradictions clashed, but one thread tied them together. Jamal was no longer just another face in the lecture hall. He had become a subject of fascination, suspicion, and debate. In the cafeteria, students chose their sides in low voices. He's a genius, man. You should have seen the way he solved that last problem in class, one student said with awe. Across the table, another shook his head. Nah, it doesn't add up. Nobody works that fast unless they're pulling answers from somewhere. Ridley knows it. That's why he's watching him. Conversations like these rippled through every corner of the campus, dividing the student body into skeptics and quiet admirers. In the lecture hall, the division was even sharper. When Jamal walked in, he felt eyes tracking him from every row. Some students leaned away, their expressions tight with judgment. Others gave subtle nods, small signs of recognition that they dared not voice aloud. The room itself seemed split in half, one side waiting for him to fall, the other waiting for him to rise again. Ridley, of course, fed the fire without ever naming it. He never spoke directly of the oral exam, but his tone sharpened when he addressed Jamal, and his questions became more pointed, more theatrical. Mr. Carter, why don't you demonstrate this? Since you seem to be ahead of the material, perhaps you can enlighten us. Each time, the eyes of the class bore into Jamal, waiting to see if he would crack. Each time, he delivered answers too precise to ignore, and each time, Ridley twisted his praise into a blade. Correct, though not without flaws in your method. The whispers outside class grew uglier. In the dorm lounge, Jamal overheard a group muttering, "Even if he's smart, he doesn't belong here. Guys like him, they get in on diversity slots, and then pretend they're prodigies." The words cut deeper than the accusation of cheating. They weren't questioning his work. They were questioning his right to exist in the room. Jamal walked past silently, but his hands trembled when he reached his room, clutching his notebook like it was the only anchor keeping him from breaking apart. Emily was one of the few who tried to cut through the noise. She approached him again after class, her voice low. "I don't know what's going on with Ridley. I think you're the smartest person in this room." Her words were sincere, but the hesitation before she spoke revealed how dangerous it felt for her to say them. Jamal gave a polite nod. Thanks. But he didn't let her see the ache in his chest, the exhaustion of carrying suspicion on his shoulders day after day. Jamal chose silence. He stopped lingering in the cafeteria, stopped attending group study sessions, stopped responding to the sideways glances. Instead, he isolated himself, burying deeper into his notebooks. He told himself that speaking out would only feed the fire. If he just kept proving himself quietly, the truth would stand on its own. But silence carried its own weight, pressing him further into loneliness. The rumors, however, didn't fade. They hardened. Some whispered admiration turned into mythology. He's not just good at calculus, he's solving graduate-level stuff in his dorm. Others turned into poison. He's stealing solutions off the internet, maybe even hacking answer keys. Each narrative grew louder than the last, and Jamal's real self, quiet, steady, unshaken, was lost somewhere between the stories people told about him. What unsettled him most wasn't the students. It was Ridley. In lectures, Ridley's smile had changed. It wasn't just dismissive anymore. It was sharp, calculating. He wasn't just humiliating Jamal in the moment. He was setting a stage. Jamal could feel it with each passing class, like a storm forming on the horizon. Ridley wasn't done. He was planning something bigger. And then, one morning, Ridley announced it. He stood at the front of the lecture hall, chalk in hand, voice booming with false enthusiasm. Ladies and gentlemen, I've decided to issue a challenge, an extra credit problem, one that has stumped even graduate students. Anyone who solves it will earn recognition, and perhaps a recommendation. His eyes flicked toward Jamal for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Everyone knew who the challenge was meant for. Gasps and murmurs filled the hall. The students leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle. Some whispered encouragement. Others sharpened their doubts. And Jamal sat frozen in his chair, notebook closed, heart steady but heavy. He knew this wasn't just a challenge, it was a trap, dressed in chalk and applause. In silence, he carried the weight of both proof and suspicion. As Ridley began sketching the unsolved problem on the board, his hand steady, his smile faint, Jamal's eyes narrowed. This wasn't about extra credit. This was war, and every student in the room was about to become a witness. The chalk screeched faintly as Ridley filled the board, his handwriting sharp, deliberate, leaving no room for ambiguity. The equation sprawled across the surface in dense symbols, a problem that most in the hall couldn't even read, much less solve. It was the kind of question whispered about in graduate lounges, the kind students avoided unless forced. When he set the chalk down, Ridley turned to the class with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This, he declared, is not a typical exercise. It has stumped many, but I believe brilliance, true brilliance, reveals itself under pressure. Anyone who solves it here and now will have my personal recommendation, an opportunity worth more than any grade. His words carried like bait, the promise dangled, shiny and irresistible, but everyone knew who it was meant for. His gaze didn't linger on Jamal, but the unspoken challenge tightened the air like a rope. The students shifted in their seats, murmurs breaking into open whispers. That's impossible. Nobody can do that. Then, a pause. Eyes slid toward Jamal, almost in unison. Some smirked. Others simply waited. The room had chosen its target before Jamal moved a muscle. Jamal sat still, his notebook closed, his eyes scanning the board. The solution flashed in his mind almost instantly, not as a guess but as a clear path laid out before him. He could do it. Every part of him knew he could. But another voice echoed in his head. The warning slip of paper. The whispers of cheater. The way Ridley twisted every victory into suspicion. Solving it wouldn't just be about math. It would be stepping directly into the trap Ridley had built. The silence stretched. Then came the first laugh. What cat got his tongue? A boy from the back leaned forward, elbowing his friend. He's supposed to be the genius, right? Let's see it. Another voice joined in. Come on, Carter. This is your moment. The jeers spread like wildfire, fueled by the tension. Every sneer in that room wasn't just mockery. It was a dare. To rise, or to remain silent forever. Jamal's heart pounded, but his face stayed calm. He had learned long ago that emotion gave people ammunition. Still, he felt the weight of their eyes pressing him forward, dragging him into the center whether he wanted it or not. Emily, seated 2 rows ahead, glanced back with a flicker of worry. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to tell him not to take the bait. But she didn't speak. No one ever did. Ridley folded his arms, leaning back against the desk. No volunteers? He asked. his voice smooth, almost mocking. Surely one of you dares to try. Or perhaps the myth of hidden genius ends here. The word myth landed like a knife, subtle, but deliberate. Laughter rippled again. Jamal stared at the board, the symbols burning into his mind. He thought of his mother's tired hands counting diner tips, of the boys in middle school who dumped his notebooks in the puddle, of every teacher who doubted his work until he drowned them in proof. He thought of the silence he carried, heavy but unbroken, and he realized this wasn't just Ridley's trap. It was a stage built to humiliate him, if he faltered, but also the only stage where truth could no longer be denied. Slowly, Jamal placed his hands on the desk in front of him and pushed himself to his feet. The laughter dimmed, replaced by a sharper kind of silence. Every eye followed his movement, as though the entire hall had shifted into orbit around him. He stepped into the aisle, his footsteps steady, echoing faintly in the hushed room. "Here we go," someone muttered, their voice trembling between excitement and cruelty. Ridley's smile curved, thin and pleased. "Mr. Carter," he said softly, though the words carried across the room, "by all means, enlighten." Jamal walked to the front, his hand brushing against the smooth wood of the desk. As he passed, Ridley handed him the chalk with a flourish, as if presenting him with a weapon he could not wield. Jamal took it without a word, his grip steady. He turned to the board, the dense equation stretching across it like a mountain. Behind him, the hall was silent, waiting for the fall. Every sneer in that room was a dare, to rise, or to remain silent forever. Jamal raised the chalk to the board, his arm steady, and the room held its breath. For the first time all semester, there was no laughter, no whisper, just silence, thick and expectant, as he prepared to write. The chalk felt foreign at first, heavy in Jamal's grip though it weighed almost nothing. He stood before the wall of symbols, the challenge Ridley had designed to trap him, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed to throb with anticipation. Behind him, students leaned forward, breaths caught in their throats, waiting for either brilliance or collapse. Jamal inhaled slowly, letting the air fill him, and then set the chalk against the board. The first stroke cut through the silence. A single line, neat and deliberate. Then another. He moved with a calm precision, his wrist steady, his thoughts flowing seamlessly into symbols. He didn't rush. Each step was measured, explained with quiet clarity. "Differentiate with respect to why," he murmured under his breath. "Not for them but for himself. Substitute here, simplify here." His words barely carried, but his actions did. The board began to transform. What had seemed like chaos to the class only minutes before now unraveled into a pattern, each line of chalk peeling back the layers of Ridley's trap. Whispers started in the back. "Wait, that makes sense. How's he even—" Then the whispers faded into silence, replaced by the scratch of chalk echoing like thunder in the still air. Minutes stretched. Jamal filled one side of the board, then shifted to the other, his movements fluid, unbroken. He paused only to check his steps, then continued, each stroke sharper, cleaner. His back was straight, his face calm, the storm he had carried all semester now harnessed into control. The room shifted with him. Where once there had been laughter, now there was awe creeping in like dawn, breaking over darkness. The same mouths that had mocked him days before now hung open, silent witnesses to a brilliance they had never expected. Even Emily, who had defended him in whispers, stared wide-eyed, her notebook forgotten. She had believed he was smart, but not like this. Not this level of mastery. This kind of control that turned impossibility into inevitability. Ridley, however, watched with a different expression. His arms were folded, jaw tight, eyes narrowing, with every passing line. At first he had stood tall, confident the boy would stumble, but now his weight shifted, his composure faltering. Jamal was not just solving the problem, he was dismantling the very narrative Ridley had built around him. At last Jamal set the chalk down. The board was full, every inch covered with a flawless sequence of steps leading to the final, unmistakable solution. He stepped back, his chest rising and falling slowly, not from exhaustion but from release. He turned, meeting the sea of eyes behind him. Silence. Complete heavy silence. It wasn't disbelief anymore. It was reverence, reluctant but undeniable. The air crackled with the shift, as though the ground itself had tilted. The room that once mocked him now sat frozen in awe. One boy whispered, almost to himself, He actually did it." Another muttered, "That's insane." Even those who despised him could not deny what was in front of them. The chalk told a story they couldn't rewrite. Ridley cleared his throat, the sound brittle. He stood, walking slowly to the board, eyes scanning Jamal's work. His finger traced the steps, searching for cracks, for errors to exploit. But each line was airtight. He lingered over one section longer, squinting, before moving on. Finally, he stepped back, his face unreadable. For a fleeting second, it seemed as though Ridley might concede. His lips parted, the weight of the truth pressing against him. But then his pride clawed its way back. "Impressive," he said finally, his voice carrying that thin, sharp edge. "Impressive, but curious." The word hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The students shifted uncomfortably, sensing what was coming. Ridley turned, his eyes cold on Jamal. "You solved this with methods beyond what we've covered in this class. Advanced approaches. Where did you learn them? Whose work are you drawing from?" His voice rose slightly, slicing through the awe that had filled the hall. "Did you read this in a journal? Did you memorize it from research papers? Because this," he gestured at the board, "is not the work of a typical freshman." The whispers started again, reshaped by Ridley's doubt.
Yeah, how would he know that? He had to copy it. Nobody just knows that.
The admiration twisted back into suspicion. Faster than Jamal had hoped, the ground beneath him felt unstable again, the silence breaking into murmurs of disbelief. Jamal stood still, his face calm, but his heart pounded. He knew what this was. Ridley couldn't find fault in the math, so he would attack the source. If the work couldn't be dismissed, then Jamal himself had to be discredited. In those lines of chalk, Jamal rewrote the story everyone had told about him. But as the whispers grew louder, Ridley's pride refused to yield. He straightened, his voice cutting through the air. "Until you prove otherwise, Mr. Carter, this looks less like genius, and more like plagiarism." The lecture hall still buzzed with whispers, the kind that carried both awe and suspicion. When Ridley's voice sliced through the noise, his gaze pinned Jamal like a blade. "Until you prove otherwise, Mr. Carter, this looks less like genius, and more like plagiarism." The words echoed against the walls, smothering whatever flicker of respect had momentarily surfaced among the students. Jamal stood before the board, the chalk dust still on his fingers, his solution shining undeniable behind him. He didn't move, didn't flinch, though inside his chest tightened. He had known this moment would come. Not the question of his math, but the question of him. His very existence in this space was the proof Ridley sought to discredit. The silence broke into scattered murmurs. Plagiarism. But he just did it, right in front of us. Yet others nodded, their doubts reignited. No way, he knew that, without outside help. It didn't matter that every line of the solution had unfolded. Ridley's accusation rewrote what they had seen, turning brilliance into suspicion. Ridley stepped closer, his tone sharp. "These techniques are not part of this course, not part of any material you've been formally taught. So tell me, Mr. Carter, where did you acquire them? Who gave you access? Or should I assume you've been lifting from sources you don't understand?" His voice dripped with implication, framing Jamal not as a mind to be admired but as a thief to be exposed. Jamal's jaw tightened. He met Ridley's eyes, his voice even. "I studied them myself, years before I got here. From books, from libraries, from online lectures. I've worked on problems like this for most of my life." His tone carried no desperation, only truth. But in the charged air, truth sounded like defiance. Ridley's lips curved in a cold smile. "Convenient story, and yet conveniently unverifiable. You see, Mr. Carter, academic dishonesty is not taken lightly at this institution. If I were to report you, an investigation would be launched. Your spotless grades, your so-called brilliance, all of it would come under scrutiny. Tell me, are you prepared for that?" The class shifted uncomfortably. Even those who admired Jamal lowered their eyes, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Jamal stood alone, his shoulders squared, refusing to bow. "I did the work," he said quietly, but firmly. "I don't need to plead for what's already true." The calm in his voice unsettled Ridley. This wasn't the trembling of a guilty student. It was the composure of someone who knew the ground he stood on. But instead of backing down, Ridley's pride only hardened. "We'll see," he said coolly. "The dean will be notified. This solution, your midterm, your entire record, it will all be reviewed. If your claims hold, then congratulations. If not," he let the sentence trail off. the silence carrying the threat more powerfully than words. For a moment, the hall seemed to shrink, every student holding their breath. Jamal's reputation, his future, his very place at the university, hung suspended. Yet he did not falter. He gathered his notebook from the desk, slipping it under his arm, and looked at Ridley with steady eyes. "Do what you need to do," Jamal said softly. "I'll still be here." The response struck like quiet thunder. No anger, no pleading, just resolve. For the first time, Ridley blinked, his composure cracking for a fraction of a second. Then he recovered, his voice rising. "Very well. I'll schedule a review with the dean. We'll see if you can perform as well under official scrutiny." Gasps rippled through the room. Some students exchanged glances, their eyes wide. The spectacle had escalated far beyond classroom politics. It had become a formal battle for legitimacy. Emily bit her lip, her hand gripping her notebook tightly. She wanted to speak, to protest, but the air was too thick with fear. To side with Jamal publicly was to risk Ridley's wrath. So she stayed silent, her eyes the only flicker of support in a sea of judgment. Ridley straightened, gathering the last of his authority. "Class dismissed," he barked, his eyes never leaving Jamal, until the students began filing out. They left in hushed clusters, whispering theories and judgments. Some pitied Jamal, some doubted him, but most simply marveled at the spectacle, eager to retell it as gossip. Jamal walked out last, his footsteps slow but steady. Behind him, Ridley erased the board with sharp strokes, as though wiping away the evidence of what had just unfolded. When power feels threatened, it clings hardest to lies. By the end of the day, word had already spread across campus. Jamal Carter was being investigated for academic dishonesty, and the dean himself would review the case. By the next morning, the entire campus seemed to know. Whispers trailed Jamal in the library, in the cafeteria, even in the quiet corners where he once found solitude. "He's under review. The dean's involved. Guess the genius wasn't so real after all." Some students said it with mockery, others with disappointment, but all said it with the thrill of scandal. Jamal carried their words like an invisible weight, heavier than any textbook. The summons came on a crisp sheet of paper, slid under his dorm door. Academic review board. Mandatory appearance. Location: Dean Whitmore's office. Time: Thursday, 10 a.m. The formal tone stung, stripping him of identity, reducing him to a case number. Jamal held the letter in his hands for a long time before setting it down on his desk. His notebooks lay open, filled with years of proof, but suddenly they looked fragile, ink and paper stacked against power and perception. Thursday arrived too soon. Jamal dressed simply, a pressed shirt, dark slacks, his hair neat. He walked across campus with his notebooks clutched tightly, the autumn wind biting at his skin. Students watched him pass, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled satisfaction. By the time he reached the dean's office, his chest was heavy, but his stride was steady. The hearing room was stark, lined with dark wood, and lit by tall windows. At the long table sat Dean Whitmore, a man with a commanding presence, his silver hair cut sharply, his expression unreadable. Beside him were 3 professors, each with files in front of them. At the end of the table sat Ridley, his posture immaculate, his eyes cold. "Mr. Carter," Whitmore said, his voice deep and formal. "You stand before this board on suspicion of academic dishonesty. Professor Ridley has brought concerns regarding the authenticity of your work. You will have the opportunity to respond. We expect truth and clarity." Ridley adjusted his glasses, sliding a file forward. "The issue is simple," he began smoothly. "Mr. Carter has repeatedly produced work far beyond the level of this course, employing methods not taught and not expected of a freshman. His midterm exam was flawless, his classroom performance unusually advanced. When asked to demonstrate, he produced a solution suspiciously similar to published graduate research. While I do not deny the appearance of talent, I argue that these consistencies suggest reliance on outside sources, rather than genuine understanding." His words dripped with authority, each syllable framed as logic rather than bias. The professors nodded slightly, their pens scratching notes. Whitmore's face remained unreadable. Jamal listened silently, his hands resting on his notebooks. When Ridley finished, Whitmore turned to him. "Mr. Carter, you may respond." Jamal stood slowly, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "I didn't cheat," he said simply. "I've studied math most of my life. Long before I came here, I didn't learn these methods in this class. I learned them because I had to. He placed his stack of notebooks on the table, the thud echoing softly in the room. These are mine. Years of work. Every page is filled with problems I solved on my own. Late at night in libraries, at my kitchen table while my mother worked double shifts. Nobody gave me the answers. I earned them. He opened the first notebook, pages covered in neat symbols, each problem written with care. Then another, and another, the ink shifting from childhood scribbles to the precise structures of advanced calculus. The professors leaned in, flipping pages, their eyes widening as they traced the evolution of his hand. The story was there in the margins. The struggle, the growth, the persistence. One professor, Dr. Alvarez, paused on a page dated 3 years earlier. This, he murmured, tapping the ink, is a derivation we teach in graduate courses. He worked it out in high school? His tone carried astonishment, not doubt. Another professor, Dr. Klein, adjusted her glasses. These are not copied. The handwriting, the corrections, the trial and error. It's organic. This is original work. For the first time, Ridley's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his pen tapping nervously against the table. He leaned forward. Notebooks can be fabricated. Anyone with enough time can copy down advanced material and backdate it. His voice was sharper now, less polished. We need more than pages of ink. We need proof he understands, not just memorizes. The room fell silent. Whitmore looked at Jamal. Professor Ridley raises a fair point. Mr. Carter, would you be willing to demonstrate here, under the board's observation? Jamal nodded, his hands steady. Yes. The truth wasn't in his words. It was in the ink of every page he had ever written. Whitmore gestured to Dr. Klein, who whispered with the others before turning back to Jamal. Her eyes were sharp, but curious. Mr. Carter, solve a graduate-level problem for us now. No notes, no preparation. Show us here and now, if what you claim is true. The boardroom air thickened after Dr. Klein's words. Solve a graduate-level problem for us now. No notes, no preparation. The challenge was a blade laid bare, sharp and unforgiving. Jamal stood at the center of the room, the weight of 3 professors' gazes pressing into him, Ridley's eyes burning with venom, and the dean's unreadable expression holding the silence taut. A sheet of paper slid across the polished table, fresh and blank. Dr. Alvarez uncapped his pen and wrote out the problem in slow, deliberate strokes. A complex system of differential equations tangled with variables, the kind reserved for advanced research seminars. When he pushed the paper toward Jamal, even the professors exchanged glances. This wasn't just a test. It was the kind of problem that could expose even the most gifted if their brilliance was shallow. Jamal picked up the pen, his hand steady. He scanned the problem once, twice, his mind already working. The equations didn't overwhelm him. They unraveled, their layers falling away, like fabric being pulled thread by thread. He began to write. His strokes were clean, deliberate, his voice quiet but firm as he explained. First, I'll isolate this variable, then apply substitution here. That reduces the system to a solvable form. The professors leaned forward. Ridley stiffened. Minutes passed. Jamal filled the page line by line, each step logical, each transition seamless. He didn't rush. His pauses weren't hesitation. They were precision, the breathing room of someone guiding others through complexity with clarity. Where most students would falter, circle back, or lose themselves in tangles, Jamal's path remained unbroken. Dr. Klein whispered under her breath, "He's not rehearsed. He's reasoning." Jamal reached the midpoint, where most attempts collapse under complexity. His hand didn't slow. He explained each transformation, each simplification, until the system shrank to its essence. Then, with a final sequence of steps, he arrived at the solution. He set the pen down softly and stepped back, his breathing even. For a long moment, the room was silent. The only sound was the faint rustle of papers, as the professors studied his work. Dr. Alvarez's brow furrowed, not in doubt, but in awe. This is correct. Flawless. Dr. Klein nodded slowly, her eyes on Jamal. And elegant. He didn't just solve it, he understood it at a level most students can't reach even after years of instruction. Ridley's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the table. He searched for words, for cracks to exploit. But the boardroom had shifted. The narrative he had spun for months dissolved under the weight of proof written in black ink. Dean Whitmore finally leaned forward, folding his hands. His voice carried authority, each word measured. Mr. Carter, what you've demonstrated today is extraordinary. Not only the ability to solve, but the clarity and originality in your method. It is clear to this board that your work is your own. There will be no charge of dishonesty. The verdict fell like a gavel. Relief didn't wash over Jamal. He had never doubted himself, but the acknowledgement, public and official, carved through the months of suspicion like light breaking into darkness. Ridley shifted in his seat, his lips tight. Dean Whitmore, surely we cannot, but Whitmore cut him off with a sharp look. Professor Ridley, this matter is closed. What I see here is not fraud, but genius. And genius deserves recognition, not suspicion. The words hung heavy, undeniable. For the first time, Jamal wasn't being tolerated, or doubted, or humiliated. He was being affirmed, his brilliance declared openly in the face of those who sought to erase it. Jamal gathered his notebooks quietly, his composure steady. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. His silence was dignity, not defiance. He knew victory didn't erase the scars of the battle. It only proved he had survived them. As he turned to leave, Dr. Klein spoke once more, her voice softer. Mr. Carter, you don't just belong here, you redefine what belonging means. Jamal met her gaze briefly, a flicker of gratitude passing in his eyes, before stepping out of the boardroom. Inside, Ridley sat rigid, his authority fractured. The professors exchanged looks, and though none said it aloud, the humiliation was clear. The man who tried to discredit his student had been exposed as smaller than the truth he tried to deny. In that moment, Jamal wasn't just a student, he was a phenomenon. By nightfall, word had spread across campus. Some whispered with admiration, others with bitterness, but everyone was talking about the hearing. Jamal Carter, the boy Ridley tried to break, had been declared a genius by the dean himself, and the campus would never look at him the same way again. By the next morning, Jamal's name was everywhere. In the dining hall, students whispered his story over trays of food. In the library, heads turned when he walked in, the same way they once turned to mock. Only now the eyes that followed him carried a mix of awe, curiosity, and guilt. The hearing had spread like wildfire. The dean himself called him a genius, one student told another, the rumor gaining detail with every retelling. Those who once laughed at Jamal now sought his presence. Students who dismissed him as a scholarship kid suddenly asked for his help with problem sets. In study groups, his chair was no longer left empty. People saved him a seat. When he walked into Ridley's lecture, the jeers and snickers had vanished. Instead, silence fell, not of contempt but of respect. Yet Jamal carried it carefully, like glass that could shatter at any moment. Respect born from humiliation was fragile. He knew they weren't admiring him for who he was. They were admiring him because he had survived the storm Ridley created. One slip, one stumble, and the whispers could turn cruel again. He felt it every time he heard someone mutter, "He's brilliant, but different." Emily approached him more often now, her tone friendlier, her smile warmer. "You know, you've become kind of a legend," she told him one afternoon in the library. Jamal gave a faint smile but didn't answer. Legends were stories told by others, reshaped until the truth was lost. He didn't want to be a story, he just wanted to be seen. At night, Jamal called his mother. Tanya listened quietly as he recounted the ordeal, his words clipped, his tone calm. "They tried to call me a fraud, Mama. But the dean said I proved myself." On the other end of the line, Tanya's breath hitched. "Baby, I knew you had it in you. I knew." Her voice trembled with pride, but also with something heavier, a mix of relief and sorrow. "They'll never understand what it cost you. But I do. And I'm proud." Jamal closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. For Tanya, his triumph was vindication of every late night, every double shift, every sacrifice. But for Jamal, it wasn't triumph, it was survival. He had been forced to bleed in public to prove he wasn't a thief of knowledge. The pride sat beside the wound, both inseparable. The campus, however, moved quickly to rewrite the story. Professors who had never noticed him before suddenly spoke his name with admiration. "Carter has a gift," one said. "He'll go far." The same mouths that would have doubted him weeks earlier now claimed to have seen his potential from the beginning. Jamal listened silently, offering no corrections. He understood the game. People loved genius when it was undeniable, but rarely before. One unexpected turn came in the form of an email from the mathematics department. Jamal was invited to join a research project under Dr. Klein, one of the professors who had defended his notebooks. The opportunity was golden, a step into the world he had dreamed of. Yet Jamal hesitated. Every line of the email reminded him of Ridley. The authority, the power imbalance, the possibility of another trap. He thought of sitting alone in that lecture hall, mocked by voices that laughed with the professor's permission. He thought of the word plagiarism echoing against the wall. Trusting another professor felt like walking into a cage willingly. That night, Jamal sat at his desk, the glow of his lamp illuminating the invitation on his screen. His notebooks lay open, pages of brilliance built in solitude. He could continue alone, safe in the margins, or step forward into a world that had already scarred him once. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "You're gonna change something, baby." But change required risk, and risk meant exposing himself again. Respect felt sweet, but the scars of prejudice still lingered beneath it. Jamal's cursor hovered over the reply button. A chance at research, at recognition, at stepping fully into the light, yet his hand trembled. What if Dr. Klein was another Ridley in disguise? The image returned in Jamal's mind, as if it had been carved into stone. Him standing before the board, chalk in hand, a wall of expectant eyes behind him. Back then, the silence had felt like judgment, a suffocating pause before the laughter that always followed. Now the memory was layered with something else. Not triumph, not even vindication, just the truth that his entire life had been distilled into that moment. Chalk on a board, his worth measured not by the clarity of his mind, but by whether others chose to see it. He thought often about that lecture hall, how the chalk dust clung to his fingers after he finished, how Ridley's eyes narrowed even as the solution stood flawless. The math had never been the hardest part. Equations obeyed rules. Logic. Beauty. They didn't care about the color of his skin, or the zip code he came from. But prejudice was not logical. Prejudice broke rules, bent truth, twisted proof until it looked like doubt. That was the hardest problem Jamal had ever faced. The kind without a formula, without a clean solution. Walking across campus in the weeks that followed, he carried himself differently. Students parted in the halls, some offering nods, others still whispering, their words now softer but no less sharp. Respect had come, yes, but it was born from spectacle. They admired him not because they had believed in him, but because they had been forced to. And Jamal knew the fragility of that kind of respect. It could vanish the moment he stumbled, the moment he didn't perform like the genius they had painted him to be. At night, when the campus quieted, and his dorm room became his sanctuary, Jamal opened his notebooks again. Page after page reminded him of where he had started. Scribbles in pencil, mistakes corrected, persistence inked into margins. These pages had carried him long before Ridley, long before the dean, long before anyone at this university knew his name. They weren't just math, they were survival. Proof that brilliance could bloom in the cracks, even when no one believed it would. One evening, his mother called. Tanya's voice carried warmth through the static. "How are they treating you now, baby?" she asked gently. Jamal hesitated before answering. "Different. They respect me now, at least some of them." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Respect is fine, but don't ever mistake it for love. The world will cheer for you today, and doubt you tomorrow. Just keep doing what you do, no matter who's watching." Her words sank deep, truer than any theorem he had ever solved. The research offer still lingered in his inbox, glowing like a door half open. Jamal hovered over it often, his hand resting on the mouse, heart heavy with uncertainty. Was it the opportunity of a lifetime, or another Ridley waiting behind a polished smile? Fear told him to stay in the shadows, but something deeper urged him forward. Change didn't come from silence. It came from stepping into the light, even when the light burned. As Jamal wrestled with the choice, the campus around him transformed his story into legend. Some students spoke of him as if he were proof that genius could come from anywhere. Others framed him as an exception, the rare one who slipped through. The truth lay somewhere in between, and Jamal felt the weight of it pressing on him. He wasn't the only one. For every Jamal Carter who managed to endure, countless others had been silenced before they had the chance. The image of the board returned once more. But this time it shifted. Jamal saw not just himself standing there, but the shadows of others' faces blurred, names forgotten. Students who had been laughed at, doubted, dismissed until they stopped trying. His story was not unique. It echoed across classrooms, across generations. A reminder pressed heavy against him. Jamal's story was not his alone. It was the story of countless others who never made it to the board, never got the chance to prove themselves, never had their notebooks seen. As he sat at his desk late into the night, Jamal closed his eyes and thought of the question that had haunted him since that first day in Ridley's class. Not whether he belonged. He knew now that he did. The real question was larger, heavier, one he wanted to leave hanging in the air for anyone who dared to listen. How many geniuses have been silenced, simply because no one believed they belonged? The lamp hummed softly, casting his shadow across the open pages. The chalk was gone, the board erased, the whispers fading into memory. But the question remained, unanswered, echoing through the quiet. And as the night deepened, Jamal knew the fight was bigger than him. The system had been exposed in one lecture hall, in one boardroom. But would it ever change, or would the next Jamal Carter be forced to pick up the chalk again, proving what should never have been in question? No one should have to bleed just to prove they belong. If Jamal's fight moved you, don't let his story be forgotten. Type yes if you believe in justice and subscribe if this broke your heart.